Chapter 41 of The Secret Service by Albert Richardson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Maria Kasper. Chapter 41. I am not a Stefano, but a cramp. The Tempest. Let every man shift for all the rest, and let no man take care for himself, for all is but fortune. The Tempest. The barn contained no fodder except damp husks. Burrowing into these, we wrapped our dripping coats about us, covered ourselves, faces and all, and shivered through the day, so weary that we drowsed a little, but too uncomfortable for any refreshing slumbers. Rising at dark, with skins irritated by atoms of husk which had penetrated our clothing, we combed out our matted hair and beards, a very faint essay toward making our toilets. Hats, gloves, handkerchiefs, and haversacks were hopelessly lost in the fodder. Hungry, cold, rheumatic, aching at every joint, we seemed to have exhausted our slender endurance. But a walk of 10 minutes took us to a slave cabin, where, as usual, we found devoted friends. The old negro killed 2 chickens, and then stood outside to watch and warn us of the patrols, should he hear the clattering hoofs of their approaching horses. His wife and daughter cooked supper, while we stood before the blazing logs of the wide-mouthed fireplace to dry our steaming garments. It was the first dwelling I had entered for nearly 20 months. It was rude almost to squalor, but it looked more palatial than the most elegant and luxurious saloon. There was a soft bed, with clean, snowy sheets. How I envied those negroes, and longed to stretch my limbs upon it and sleep for a month. There were chairs, a table, plates, knives and forks, the commonest comforts of life, which, like sweet cold water, clean clothing, and pure air, we never appreciate until once deprived of them. We eagerly devoured the chickens and hot cornbread, and drank steaming cups of green tea, which our ebony hostess, unfamiliar with the beverage that cheers but not inebriates, prepared under my directions. Before starting, I had taken the precaution to fill a pocket with tea, which I had been saving more than a year for that purpose. In commercial parlance, tea was tea in the Confederacy. The last pound we purchased for daily use cost us $127 in rebel currency, and we were compelled to send to Wilmington before we could obtain it even at that price. It is an article little used by the Southerners, who are inveterate coffee drinkers. All along our route we found the women, white and black, ignorant of the art of making tea without instructions. Captain Wolfe assured us that his father had once attended a log rolling in South Carolina, where, as a rare and costly luxury, the host regaled the workers with tea at the close of their labors. But, unacquainted with its use, they were only presented with the boiled leaves to eat. After this novel banquet, one old lady thus expressed the views of the rural assembly: "Wall, I never tasted this before. It is pleasant enough, but, except for the name of it, I don't consider tea a bit better than any other kind of greens." Experience on the Great Plains and among the Rocky Mountains had taught me the superiority of tea over all stronger stimulants in severe, protracted hardships. Now it proved of inestimable service to us. After a 2 hours' halt, refreshed by food and dry clothing, we seemed to have a new lease of life. Elastic and vigorous, we felt equal to almost any labor. "May God bless you," said the old woman, bidding us adieu, while earnest sympathy shone from her own and her daughter's eyes, and illumined their dark faces. To us they were black and comely, too. The husband led us to the railroad, and there parted from us. At midnight we were 23 miles from Salisbury, and 3 from Statesville. We wished to avoid the latter village, and leaving the railway, which ran due west, turned further northward. In 2 miles we expected to strike the Wilkesboro road at Allison's Mill. We followed the old negro's directions as well as possible, but soon suspected that we must be off the route. It was bitterly cold, and to avoid suffering, we walked on with great rapidity. Before daylight, at a large plantation, we wakened a slave, and learned that since leaving the railway, we had traveled 12 miles circuitously, and gained just 1/2 mile on the journey. There were 2 Allison's Mills, and our black friend had directed us to the wrong one. "Can you conceal us here today?" we asked in a whisper of the negro who gave us this information from his bed in a little cabin. "I reckon so. Master is a terrible war man, a Confederate officer, and would kill me if he were to find it out. But I kept a sick Yankee captain here last summer for 5 days, and then he went on. Go to the barn and hide, and I will see you when I come to fodder the horses." We found the barn, groped our way up into a hayloft under the eaves, and buried ourselves in the straw. 5. Thursday, December 22nd. The biting wind whistled and shrieked between the logs of the barn, and cover ourselves as we would, it was too cold for sleep. The negro, an intelligent young man, spent several hours with us, asking questions about the North, brought us ample supplies of food, and a bottle of apple brandy purloined from his master's private stores. At dark he took us into his quarters, only separated by a narrow lane from the planter's house, and we were warmed and fed. A dozen of the blacks, including little boys and girls of 10 and 12 years, visited us there. Among them was a peculiarly intelligent mulatto woman of 25, comely and neatly dressed. The poor girl interrogated us for an hour very earnestly about the progress of the war, its probable results, and the feeling and purposes of the North touching the slaves. Using language with rare propriety, she impressed me as one who would willingly give up life for her unfortunate race. With culture and opportunity, she would have been an intellectual and social power in any circle. She was the wife of a slave, but her companions told us that she had been compelled to become the mistress of her master. She spoke of him with intense loathing. By this time we had learned that every black face was a friendly face. So far as fidelity was concerned, we felt just as safe among the negroes as if in our northern homes. Male or female, old or young, intelligent or simple, we were fully assured they would never betray us. Someone has said that it needs 3 generations to make a gentleman. Heaven only knows how many generations are required to make a free man. But we have been accustomed to consider this perfect trustworthiness, this complete loyalty to friends, a distinctively Saxon trait. The very rare degree to which the negroes have manifested it is an augury of brightest hope and promise for their future. It is a faint indication of what they may one day become with justice, time, and opportunity. They were always ready to help anybody opposed to the rebels. Union refugees, Confederate deserters, escaped prisoners, all received from them the same prompt and invariable kindness. But let a rebel soldier, on his way to the army or returning from it, apply to them, and he would find but cold kindness. The moment they met us, they would do whatever we required upon impulse and instinct. But afterward, when there was leisure for conversation, they would question us with some anxiety. Few had ever seen a Yankee before. They would repeat to us the bugbear stories of their masters, about our whipping them to force them into the Union army and starving their wives and children. Professing utterly to discredit these reports, they still desired a little reassurance. We can never forget their upturned eager eyes and earnest faces. Happily, we could tell them that the nation was rising to the great principles of freedom, education, and an open career for every human being. Starting at 10 o'clock tonight, we had an arduous march over the rough frozen ground. Hard labor and loss of sleep began to tell on us. I think every member of the party had his mental balance more or less shaken. Davis was haggard, with bloodshot eyes. Junius was pallid and threatened with typhoid fever. Wolfe, with a sprained ankle, could barely limp. I was weak and short of breath from the pneumonic affection. Charlie Thurston was our best foot, and we always put him foremost. With his Confederate uniform and his ready invention, he could play a rebel soldier admirably. Toward morning, we were compelled to stop, build a fire in the dense pine forest, and rest for an hour. We were uncertain about the roads, and just before daylight, Charlie stopped to make inquiries of an old farmer. Then we went on, and as the road was very secluded, we were talking with less discretion than usual, when a twig snapped behind us. Instantly turning around, we saw the old man following stealthily, listening to our conversation. We ordered him to halt, but he ran away with wonderful agility for a septuagenarian. The moment he was out of sight, we left the road and ran, too, in an opposite direction, fast as our tired limbs could carry us. It would be a very nice point to determine which was the more frightened, we or our late pursuer. We afterward learned that he was an unrelenting rebel and a zealous home guard. He was doubtless endeavoring to follow us to our shelter, that he might bring out his company and capture us during the day. Long after daylight, we continued running until we had put 5 miles between ourselves and the road. The region was very open, and it seemed morally certain that we would be discovered through the barking dogs at some of the farmhouses. But about 9 o'clock we halted in a pine grove, small but thick, and built a great fire of rails, which, being very dry, emitted little smoke. There was danger that the blaze would be discovered, but in our feeble condition we could no longer endure the inclemency of the weather. 6. Friday, December 23rd. Hungry and fatigued, with our feet to the fire, we could sleep an hour at a time upon the frozen ground before the cold awakened us. When, after a waiting which seemed endless, the welcome darkness came at last, it lifted a load from our hearts. We no longer listened anxiously for the coming of the guard. Starting again, we toiled on with slow and painful steps. We were entering a region where slaves were few, and we could find no negroes. Junius, in a high fever, was so weak that we were almost compelled to carry him, and his voice was faint as the wail of an infant. Again and again he begged us to go on and leave him to rest upon the ground. We had sore apprehensions that it might become necessary to commit him to the first friends we could find and press forward without him. About 8 o'clock, Charlie entered a little tavern to procure provisions. He assumed his favorite character of a rebel soldier on parole, going to his home in Wilkes County for the holidays. An old man was spending the night there. While supper was cooking, he gave to Charlie a recognizing sign of the Sons of America. It was instantly answered, and stepping outside, they had an interview. Then our new friend stealthily led his 3 mules from the tavern stable through the fields to the road, placed 3 of us upon them, and guided us 5 miles to the house of his brother, another strong Union man. The brother warmed us, fed us, and stayed us with flagons of apple brandy, then brought out 2 of his mules, and again we pressed forward. They cautioned us not to entrust the secret of their assistance to anyone, reminding us that it would be a hanging matter for them. So, on this cold winter night, while we were so stiff and exhausted that we could barely keep our seats on the steeds they had so thoughtfully furnished, these kind friends conducted us 15 miles, and left us in the Union settlement we were seeking, 50 miles from Salisbury. End of chapter 41. . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . Chapter 42 of The Secret Service by Albert Richardson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Maria Kasper. Chapter 42. Weariness can snore upon the flint. Cymbeline. Montano. But is he often thus? Iago. 'Tis evermore the prologue to his sleep. Othello. It was now 5 o'clock in the morning of Saturday, December 24th, the 7th day of our escape. Leaving my companions behind, I tapped at the door of a log house. "Come in," said a voice, and I entered. In its one room, the children and father were still in bed. The wife was already engaged in her daily duties. I asked, "Can you direct me to the widow blank?" "There are 2 widow blanks in this neighborhood," she replied. "What is your name?" I was seeking information just then, not giving it, so, avoiding the question, I added, "The lady I mean has a son who is an officer in the army." "They both have sons who are officers in the army. Don't be afraid, you are among friends." Friends might mean Union, or it might mean Rebel. So I accepted no amendments, but adhered to the main question. "This officer is a lieutenant, and his name is John." "Well," said she, "they are both lieutenants, and John is the name of both." I knew my man too well to be baffled. I continued, "He is in the 2nd Regiment of the Senior Reserves, and he is now on duty at blank." "Oh," said she, "that is my brother." At once I told her what we were. She replied with a wonderful light of welcome shining in her eyes. "If you are Yankees, all I have to say is that you have come to exactly the right place." And in an exuberant joy she bustled about, doing a dozen things at once, talking incoherently the while, replenishing the fire, bringing me to a seat, offering me food, urging her husband to hurry out for the rest of the party. At last her excitement culminated in her darting under the bed and reappearing on the surface with a great pint tumbler filled to the brim with apple brandy. There was enough to intoxicate our whole party. It was the first form of hospitality which occurred to her. Afterward, when better acquainted, she explained, "You were the first Yankee I ever saw. The moment I observed your clothing, I knew you must be one, and I wanted to throw my arms about your neck and kiss you." We heartily reciprocated the feeling. Just then the only woman who had any charms for us was the Goddess of Liberty, and this, at least, was one of her handmaidens. We were soon by the great log fire of a house where friends awaited us. Belonging to the secret Union organization, they had received intelligence that we were on the way. Our feet were blistered and swollen, mine were frostbitten. We removed our clothing, and were soon reposing in soft feather beds. At noon, awakened for breakfast, we found Junius had been sleeping like a child, and was now hungry, a relief to our anxiety. After the meal was over, we returned to bed. Our friends were constantly on the alert, but the house was very secluded, and they were not compelled to watch outside. There 2 ferocious dogs were on guard, rendering it unsafe for anyone to come within 100 yards of them. Nearly all the people, loyal and rebel, had similar sentinels. Along the route we had been anathematizing the canine race, which often prevented us from approaching negro quarters on the plantations. But these were Union dogs, which made all the difference in the world. At dark we were conducted to a barn, where, wrapped in quilts, we passed a comfortable night. 8. Sunday, December 25th. Our resting place was in Wilkes County, North Carolina, among the outlying spurs of the Alleghanies, a county so strong in its Union sentiments that the Rebels called it the Old United States. Among the mountains of every Southern State, a vast majority of the people were loyal. Hilly regions, unadapted to cotton culture, contained few negroes, and where there was no slavery, there was no rebellion. Milton's verse, "The mountain nymph, sweet Liberty," contains a great truth the world over. Our self-sacrificing friends belonged to a multitudinous family, extending through a settlement many miles in length. They all seemed to be nephews, cousins, or brothers, and the white-haired patriarch, at 70, erect and agile as a boy, in whose barn we remained today, was father, grandfather, or uncle to the whole tribe. His loyalty was very stanch and intense. "The Home Guards," said he, "are usually pretty civil. Occasionally they shoot at some of the boys who are hiding, but pretty soon afterward one of them is found in the woods some morning with a hole in his head. I suppose there are 1,000 young men lying out in this county. I have always urged them to fight the Guards, and I have helped to supply them with ammunition. 2 or 3 times regiments from Lee's army have been sent here to hunt conscripts and deserters, and then the boys have to run. I have a son among them, but they never wounded him yet. I asked him the other day, 'Won't you kill some of them before you are ever captured?' 'Well, father,' says he, 'I'll be found a trying.' I reckon he will, too, for he has never gone without his rifle these 2 years, and he can bring down a squirrel every time from the top of yon oak you see on the hill." The barn was beside a public road, and very near the house of a woman whose Rebel sympathies were strong. There was danger that anyone entering it might be seen by her or her children, who were running about the yard. But we held quite a levee to-day. I think we had 50 visitors. We would hear the opening door and stealthy footsteps upon the barn floor, and then a soft voice would ask, "Friends, are you there?" We would rise from our bed of hay and come forward to the front of the loft to find some member of this great family of friends who had brought his wife and children to see the Yankees. We would converse with them for a few minutes. They would invariably ask if there was nothing whatever that they could do for us, invite us to visit their house by night, and express the warmest wishes for our success. They did this with such perfect spontaneity, with such overflowing hearts, that it touched us very nearly. Had we been their own sons or brothers, they could not have treated us more tenderly. This Christmas may have witnessed more brilliant gatherings than ours, but none, I am sure, warmed by a more self-sacrificing friendship. Among others, we were visited by a conscript who had been one of our guards at Salisbury. While at the prison, his great portly form would come laboring and puffing up the stairs to our quarters. With flushed face, he would sit down, glance cautiously around to assure himself that none but friends were present, then question us eagerly about the North, and breathe out maledictions against all Confederates. The Rebels, suspecting him, determined to send him to Lee's army. But he was just then taken with rheumatism, and kept to his quarters for 6 weeks. At last, the day before he was to start for Richmond, he obtained permission of the surgeon to visit the village. He hobbled up the street, groaning piteously, but after turning the first corner, threw away his crutches, plunged into the woods, and made his way home by night. He now related his experiences with a quiet chuckle, and was very desirous of serving us. He was able to give me a pair of large boots in place of my own, which lacerated my sore and swollen feet. The sharp rocks, hills, and stumps compelled me to have the new boots repaired 7 times before reaching our lines. 2 nights' traveling would quite wear out the ill-tanned leather of the stoutest shoes. Today our friends brought us twice as much food as we wanted, and we wanted a good deal. At dark, alarmed by a rumor that the suspicions of the guard had been excited, they took us several miles into a neighboring county to a very secluded house, occupied by the wife and daughters of an officer in the Confederate army. Here we spent the night in inviting beds. 9. Monday, December 26th. Our hostess, a comely lady of 35, was a second Mrs. Katy Scudder, the very embodiment of faculty. Her plain log house, with its snowy curtains, cheap prints and engravings cut from illustrated newspapers, was tasteful and inviting. Her 5 daughters, all clothed in fabric spun and woven at home, for these people were now entirely self-dependent, looked as pretty and tidy to uncritical masculine eyes as if robed in silk and cashmere. Our pursuit of a quiet refuge proved ludicrously unsuccessful. The day was diversified by more pangs and fears than wars or women have. But the lady bore herself with such coolness, and proved so ready for every emergency, that we enjoyed them rather than otherwise. Early in the morning, while standing a few yards from the house, I saw her and her daughter suddenly step into the open doorway, quite filling it with their persons and skirts, and earnestly beckon me to go in out of sight. Of course I obeyed. A woman of questionable political soundness had called, but they attracted her in another direction, keeping her face turned away from the door, till I was lost to sight. Several parties of Rebel cavalry passed down the road. Breckinridge's army in the mountains above had recently dissolved in a great thaw and break-up, and these were all the small fragments of ice floating down toward Virginia. A squad of a dozen stopped and entered the house, which was of 1 story, the length of 3 large rooms. But the lady kept them in the kitchen, while we were shut in the other end of the building. Next, the barking dog warned us of approaching footsteps. At her suggestion, we went up into the corn loft above our apartment. The new visitor was a neighbor, to whom she owed a bushel of corn, and who, with his ox cart, had come to collect it. With ready woman's wit, she said to him, "You know my husband is away. I have no fuel. Won't you go and haul me a load of wood as a Christmas present?" Who could resist such a feminine appeal? The neighbor went for the wood, while she came laughing in to tell us her stratagem. We descended from the corn loft, and went into a back room, where there were 2 beds, one large and the other small, with an open door between them. 4 of us crept under the large bed, one under the small one, and here we had an experience ludicrous enough to remember, but not so pleasant to undergo. One of our party was an inveterate snorer. Whenever he took a recumbent position with his head upon the ground or the floor, he would begin snoring like a steam engine. Like all persons of that class, when reminded of it, he steadfastly vowed that he never snored in all his life. For a time he regarded our awakening him with rebuke and caution as a sorry practical joke. Thus far, I believe our danger of detection had been greater from this source than from any other. We had always traveled in single file, almost like specters, with our leader thrown out as far ahead as we could keep him in view. Whenever he thought he saw danger, he raised a warning hand, every man passed the sign back to those in his rear, and dropped quietly behind a log or stepped into the bushes until the person had passed or the alarm was explained. We walked with the softest footsteps, no man coughing or speaking above his breath. During the day we were often concealed in very public places, only a few feet from the road, where, the ground being covered with snow, we could not hear approaching footsteps. Now our musical companion chanced to go under the small bed, and in 3 minutes we heard his trumpet-tongued snore. At first we whispered to him, but we might as well have talked to Niagara. If one of us went to him, there was danger that the neighbor, who stood upon the front porch, would see us through the open door. But if we did not, that fatal snore was certain to be heard. So I darted across the room, crept in beside my friend, and kept him well shaken until the danger was over. At night the lady told us that more people had come to her house during that day than ever visited it in a month before, and we were marched back through the darkness to our first place of concealment. 10. Tuesday, December 27th. In the barn through the whole day. A messenger brought us a note from 2 late fellow prisoners, Captain William Boothby, a Philadelphia mariner, and Mr. John Mercer, a Unionist of New Bern, North Carolina, who had been in duress almost 3 years. They were now hiding in a barn 2 miles from us. They escaped from Salisbury 2 nights later than we, paying the guards $800 in Confederate money to let them out. Thurston at once joined them. During the rest of the journey, we sometimes traveled and hid together for several days and nights. But when there was special danger, we divided into 2 companies, one keeping 24 hours in advance. The smaller the party, the less peril being involved. Now, for the first time, we began to have some hope of reaching our lines. But the road was still very long and fraught with many dangers. We examined the appalling list of dead which I had brought from Salisbury, and talked much of our companions left behind in that living entombment, remembering how earnestly they longed and prayed for some intelligent, trustworthy voice to bear to the government and the people tidings of their terrible condition. We pledged each other very solemnly that if any one of us lived to regain home and freedom, he should use earnest, unremitting efforts to excite sympathy and secure relief for them. It may not be out of place here to say that upon reaching the North, before visiting our families or performing any other duties, we hastened to Washington and used every endeavor to call the attention of the authorities and the country to the Salisbury prisoners. Before many weeks, all who survived were exchanged, but more than 5,000, upwards of half the number who were taken to Salisbury 5 months before, were already buried just outside the garrison. Those 5,000 loyal graves will ever remain fitting monuments of Rebel cruelty, and of the atrocious inhumanity of Edwin M. Stanton, Secretary of War, who steadfastly refused to exchange these prisoners, on the ground that we could not afford to give the enemy robust, vigorous men for invalids and skeletons, and yet refrained from compelling them to treat prisoners with humanity by just and discriminating retaliation upon an equal number of Rebel officers taken from the great excess held by our government. Today, as usual, we saw a large number of the Union mountaineers. Theirs was a very blind and unreasoning loyalty, much like the disloyalty of some enthusiastic Rebels. They did not say Unionist or secessionist, but always designated a political friend thus: "He is one of the rot sort of people," strong in the faith that there could by no possibility be more than one side to the question. They had little education, but when they began to talk about the Union, their eyes lighted wonderfully, and sometimes they grew really eloquent. They did not believe one word in a Rebel newspaper, except extracts from the Northern journals and reports favorable to our cause. They thought the Union army had never been defeated in a single battle. I heard them say repeatedly, "The United States can take Richmond any day when it wants to. That it has not thus far is owing to no lack of power, but because it was not thought best." They regarded every Rebel as necessarily an unmitigated scoundrel, and every Loyalist, particularly every native-born Yankee, almost as an angel from heaven. How earnestly they questioned us about the North! How they longed to escape thither! To them, indeed, it was the promised land. They were very bitter in their denunciations of the heavy slaveholders who had done so much to degrade white labor and finally brought on this terrible war. They had an abundance of the 2 great Southern staples, cornbread and pork. They felt severely the absence of their favorite beverage, and would ask us, with amusing earnestness, if they could get coffee when our armies came. The Confederate substitutes, burnt corn and rye, they regarded with earnest and well-founded aversion. They were compelled to use thorns for fastening the clothing of the women and children. We distributed among them our small supply of pins, to their infinite delectation. Davis also gladdened the hearts of all the womankind by disbursing a needle to each. A needle nominally represented $5 in Confederate currency, but actually could not be purchased at any price. A number of the young men, lying out, desired to accompany us to the North. Some were deserters from the Rebel army, Others, more fortunate, had evaded conscription from the beginning of the war. But their lives had been passed in that remote county of North Carolina, and the 290 miles yet to be accomplished stretched out in appalling perspective. They saw many lions in the way, and, Festus-like, at the last moment, decided to wait for a more convenient season. It was not for lack of nerve, for some of them had fought Rebel guards with great coolness and bravery. Our friends feared that one slave-holding secessionist in the neighborhood might learn of our presence and betray us. He did ascertain our whereabouts, but sent us an invitation to visit his house, offering to supply all needed food, clothing, and shelter. He said he foolishly acquiesced in the revolution because at first it seemed certain to succeed, and he wished to save his property, but that now he heartily repented. Possibly his conversion was partially owing to remorse for having persuaded his 2 sons to enter the Rebel army. One, after much suffering, had deserted, and was now lying out near home. The other, wounded and captured in a Virginia battle, was still in a Northern prison, where he had been confined for many months. The father was very desirous of sending to him a message of sympathy and affection. But he was an index of the change which had recently come over Rebel sympathizers in that whole region. The condition of our armies, then, was not peculiarly promising. We were by no means sanguine that the war would soon terminate. But the loyal mountaineers, with unerring instinct, were all confident that we were near its close, and constantly surprised us by speaking of the rebellion as a thing of the past. We fancied their wish was father to the thought, but they proved truer prophets than we. End of chapter 42. Chapter 43 of The Secret Service by Albert Richardson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Maria Kasper. Chapter 43. Nay, but make haste, the better foot before. King John. On the evening of the 11th day, Wednesday, December 28th, we left the kind friends with whom we had stayed for 5 days and 4 nights, gaining new vigor and inspired by new hope. Their last injunction was, "Remember, you cannot be too careful. We shall pray God that you may reach your homes in safety. When you are there, do not forget us, but do send troops to open a way by which we can escape to the north." In their simplicity, they fancied Yankees omnipotent, and that we could send them an army by merely saying the word. They bade us adieu with embraces and tears. I am sure many a fervent prayer went up from their humble hearths, that our Father would guide us through the difficulties of the long, wearisome journey, and guard us against the perils which beset and environed it. At 10 o'clock, we passed within 200 yards of a Rebel camp. We could hear the neigh of the horses and the tramp of 4 or 5 sentinels on their rounds. We trod very softly. To our stimulated senses, every sound was magnified, and every cracking twig startled us. Leaving us in the road a few yards behind, our pilot entered the house of his friend, a young deserter from the Rebel army. Finding no one there but the family, he called us in to rest by the log fire, while the deserter rose from bed and donned his clothing to lead us 3 miles and point out a secluded path. For many months he had been lying out, but of late, as the guards were less vigilant than usual, he sometimes ventured to sleep at home. His girlish wife wished him to accompany us through, but with the infant sleeping in the cradle, which was hewn out of a great log, she formed a tie too strong for him to break. At parting, she shook each of us by the hand, saying, "I hope you will get safely home, but there is great danger, and you must be powerful cautious." At 11 o'clock, our guide left us in the hands of a negro, who, after our chilled limbs were warmed, led us on our way. By 2 in the morning we had accomplished 13 miles over the frozen hills, and reached a lonely house in a deep valley beside a tumbling, flashing torrent. The farmer, roused with difficulty from his heavy slumbers, informed us that Boothby's party, which had arrived 24 hours in advance of us, was sleeping in his barn. He sent us half a mile to the house of a neighbor, who fanned the dying embers on his great hearth, regaled us with the usual food, and then took us to a barn in the forest. "Climb up on that scaffolding," said he. "Among the husks you will find 2 or 3 quilts. They belong to my son, who is lying out. Tonight he is sleeping with some friends in the woods." The cold wind blew searchingly through the open barn, but before daylight we were wrapped in the mantle that covers all human thoughts. 12. Thursday, December 29th. At dark, our host, leaving us in a thicket 500 yards from his house, went forward to reconnoiter. Finding the coast clear, he beckoned us on to supper and ample potations of apple brandy. With difficulty, we induced one of his neighbors to guide us. Though unfamiliar with the road, he was an excellent walker, swiftly leading us over the rough ground, which tortured our sensitive feet, and up and down sharp, rocky hills. At 2 in the morning we flanked Wilkesboro, the capital of Wilkes County. To a chorus of barking dogs, we crept softly around it, within a few hundred yards of the houses. The air was full of snow, and when we reached the hills again, the biting wind was hard to breathe. We walked about a mile through the dense woods, when Captain Wolfe, who had been all the time declaring that the North Star was on the wrong side of us, convinced our pilot that he had mistaken the road, and we retraced our steps to the right thoroughfare. We stopped to warm for half an hour at a negro cabin, where the blacks told us all they knew about the routes and the rebels. Before morning we were greatly broken down, and our guide was again in doubt concerning the roads. So we entered a deep ravine in the pine woods, built a great fire, and waited for daylight. 13. Friday, December 30th. After dawn, we pressed forward, reluctantly compelled to pass near 2 or 3 houses. We reached the Yadkin River, just as a young, blooming woman, with a face like a ripe apple, came gliding across the stream. With a long pole she guided the great log canoe, which contained herself, a pail of butter, and a side saddle, indicating that she had started for the Wilkesboro market. Assisting her to the shore, we asked, "Will you tell us where Ben Hanby lives?" "Just beyond the hill there, across the river," she replied, with scrutinizing, suspicious eyes. "How far is it to his house?" "I don't know." "More than a mile?" "No," doubtfully. "I reckon not." "Is he probably at home?" "No," emphatically. "He is not. Are you the home guard?" "By no means, madam. We are Union men, and Yankees at that. We have escaped from Salisbury, and are trying to reach our homes in the North." After another searching glance, she trusted us fully, and said, "Ben Hanby is my husband. He is lying out. I wondered, if you were the guard, what you could be doing without guns. From a hill near our house, the children saw you coming more than an hour ago, and my husband, taking you for the soldiers, went with his rifle to join his companions in the woods. Word has gone to every Union house in the neighborhood that the troops are out hunting deserters." We embarked in the log canoe, and shipped a good deal of water before reaching the opposite shore. We had 2 sea captains on board, and concluded that with 1 sailor more we should certainly have been hopelessly wrecked. A winding forest path led to the lonely house we sought, where we found no one at home except 3 children of our fair informant and their grandmother. For more than 2 hours we could not allay that woman's suspicions that we were guards. They had recently been adopting Yankee disguises, deceiving Union people and beguiling them of damaging information. As indignantly as General Damas inquires whether he looks like a married man, we asked the cautious women if we resembled rebels. At last, convinced that we were veritable Yankees, she gave us breakfast, and sent one of the children with us to a sunny hillside among the pines, where we slept off the weariness and soreness caused by the night's march of 16 miles. At evening, a number of friends visited us. As they were not merely rebel deserters, but Union bushwhackers also, we regarded them with curiosity, for we had been wont to regard bushwhackers of either side with vague, undefined horror. These men were walking arsenals. Each had a trusty rifle, 1 or 2 navy revolvers, a great bowie knife, haversack, and canteen. Their manners were quiet, their faces honest, and one had a voice of rare sweetness. As he stood tossing his baby in the air, with his little daughter clinging to his skirt, he looked the mildest mannered man that ever scuttled a ship or cut a throat. He and his neighbors had adopted this mode of life because determined not to fight against the old flag. They would not attempt the uncertain journey to our lines, leaving their families in the country of the enemy. Ordinarily very quiet and rational, whenever the war was spoken of, their eyes emitted that peculiar glare which I had observed years before in Kansas, and which seems inseparable from the hunted man. They said, "When the rebels let us alone, we let them alone. When they come out to hunt us, we hunt them. They know that we are in earnest, and that before they can kill any one of us, he will break a hole in the ice large enough to drag 2 or 3 of them along with him. At night we sleep in the bush. When we go home by day, our children stand out on picket. They and our wives bring food to us in the woods. When the guards are coming out, some of the Union members usually inform us beforehand. Then we collect 20 or 30 men, find the best ground we can, and if they discover us, fight them. But a number of skirmishes have taught them to be very wary about attacking us." In this dreary mode of life they seemed to find a certain fascination. While we took supper at the house of one of them, 8 bushwhackers, armed to the teeth, stood outside on guard. For once, at least, enjoying what Macbeth vainly coveted, we took our meal in peace. 2 of them were United States volunteers, who had come stealthily home on furlough from our army in Tennessee. They were the first Union soldiers we had seen at liberty for nearly 2 years. Their faces were very welcome, and their worn, soiled uniforms were, to our eyes, the reflection of heaven's own blue. Our friends urged us to remain, one of them saying, "The snow is deep out on the Blue Ridge and the Alleghanies. The rebels can easily trace you. The guerrillas are unusually vigilant, and it is very unsafe to attempt crossing the mountains at present. I started for Knoxville 3 weeks ago, and after walking 50 miles was compelled to turn back. Stay with us until the snow is gone and the guards less on the alert. We will each of us take 2 of you under our special charge, and feed and shelter you until next May, if you desire it." The Blue Ridge was still 25 miles away, and we were determined to push on to a point where we could look the danger, if danger there were, directly in the face. The bushwhackers therefore piloted us through the darkness and the bitter cold for 7 miles. At midnight we reached the dwelling of a Union man. He said, "As the house is unsafe, I shall be compelled to put you in my barn. You will find 2 rebel deserters sleeping there." The barn was upon a high hill. We burrowed among the husks, at first to the infinite alarm of the deserters, who thought the Philistines were upon them. While we shivered in the darkness, they told us that they had come from Petersburg, more than 500 miles, and been 3 months on the journey. They had found friends all the way, among negroes and Union men. Ragged, dirty, and penniless, they said very quietly that they were going to reach the Yankee lines or die in the attempt. Before daylight our host visited us, and finding that we suffered from the weather, placed us in a little warm storehouse close beside the public road. To our question whether the guards had ever searched it, he replied, "Oh, yes, frequently, but they never happened to find anybody." After we were snugly ensconced in quilts and cornstalks, Davis said, "What an appalling journey still stretches before us. I fear the lamp of my energy is nearly burned out." I could not wonder at his despondency. For several years he had been half an invalid, suffering from a spinal affection. For weeks before leaving Salisbury, he was often compelled of an afternoon to lie upon his bunk of straw with a blinding headache, and every nerve quivering with pain. Junius and myself frequently said, "Davis's courage is unbounded, but he can never live to walk to Knoxville." The event proved us false prophets. Nightly he led our party, always the last to pause and the first to start. His lamp of energy was so far from being exhausted that before he reached our lines he broke down every man in the party. I expect to suffer to my dying day from the killing pace of that energetic invalid. 14. Saturday, December 31st. Spent all this cold day and night sleeping in the quilts and fodder of the little storehouse. At evening, Boothby's party went forward, as the next 35 miles were deemed specially perilous. End of chapter 43.
Chapter 44 of The Secret Service by Albert Richardson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Giordano. Chapter 44. Pray you tread softly, that the blind mole may not hear a footfall. Tempest. There's but a shirt and a half in all my company, and the half shirt is 2 napkins pinned together and thrown over the shoulders. King Henry IV. Our emaciated condition, hard labor, and the bracing mountain air, conspired to make us ravenous. In quantity, the pork and cornbread which we devoured was almost miraculous. In quality, it seemed like the nectar and ambrosia of the immortal gods. It was far better adapted to our necessities than the daintiest luxuries of civilization. In California, Australia, and Colorado gold mines, on the New Orleans levee, and wherever else the most trying physical labor is to be performed, pork and cornbread have been found the best articles of food. The Loyalists were all ready to feed, shelter, and direct us, but reluctant to accompany us far from their homes. They would say, "You need no guides, the road is so plain that you cannot possibly miss it." But midnight journeys among the narrow lanes and obscure mountain paths had taught us that we could miss any road whatever, which was not enclosed upon both sides by fences too high for climbing. Therefore we insisted upon pilots. Money concealed in clothing. Fortunately, I had left Salisbury with a $100 United States note concealed under the hem of each leg of my pantaloons, just above the instep, and 2 more sewn in the lining of my coat. I had in my porte-monnaie $50 in Northern bank notes, $5 in gold, and $100 in Confederate currency. Davis brought away about the same amount. We should have left it with our fellow prisoners, but for the probability of being recaptured and confined, where money would serve us in our extremest need. Now it enabled us to remunerate amply both our white and black friends. Sometimes the mountaineers would say, "We do not do these things for money. We have fed and assisted hundreds of refugees and escaping prisoners, but never received a cent for it." Those whom they befriended were usually penniless. We appreciated their kindness none the less because fortunate enough to be able to recompense them. They were unable to resist the argument that, when our forces came, they would need greenbacks to purchase coffee. Imminent peril of Union citizens. Every man who gave us a meal, sheltered us in his house or barn, pointed out a refuge in the woods, or directed us 1 mile upon our journey, did it at the certainty, if discovered, of being imprisoned or forced into the Rebel army, whether sick or well, and at the risk of having his house burned over his head. In many cases, discovery would have resulted in his death by shooting or hanging in sight of his own door. During our whole journey, we entered only one house inhabited by white Unionists, which had never been plundered by Home Guards or Rebel guerrillas. Almost every loyal family had given to the cause some of its nearest and dearest. We were told so frequently, "My father was killed in those woods," or "The guerrillas shot my brother in that ravine," that, finally, these tragedies made little impression upon us. The mountaineers never seemed conscious that they were doing any heroic or self-sacrificing thing. Their very sufferings had greatly intensified their love for the Union, and their faith in its ultimate triumph. Drowsily wondering at our capacity for sleep, we dozed through the first day of the new year, and the 15th of our liberty. After dark we spent 2 hours in the house before the log fire. The good woman had one son already escaped to the North, a fresh link which bound her mother heart to that ideal paradise. She fed us, mended our clothing, and parted from us with the heartiest "God bless you." Her youngest born, a lad of 11 years, accompanied us 5 miles to the house of a Unionist, who received us without leaving his bed. He gave us such minute information about the faint, obscure road that we found little difficulty in keeping it. Fording creeks at midnight. Through the biting air, we pressed rapidly up the narrow valley of a clear, tumbling mountain stream, whose frowning banks, several hundred feet in height, were covered with pines and hemlocks. In 12 miles the road crossed the creek 29 times. Instead of bridges were fords for horsemen and wagons, and foot logs for pedestrians. Cold and stiff, we discovered that crossing the smooth, icy logs in the darkness was a hazardous feat. Wolfe was particularly lame, and slipped several times into the icy torrent, but managed to flounder out without much delay. He endured with great serenity all our suggestions, that even though water was his native element, he had a very eccentric taste to prefer swimming to walking, in that state of the atmosphere. At one crossing the log was swept away. We wandered up and down the stream, which was about 100 feet wide, but could find not even the hair which Mahomet discovered to be the bridge over the bottomless pit. But as canoes are older than ships, so logs are more primitive than bridges. We even plunged in, waist deep, and waded through among the cakes of floating ice. Looped and windowed raggedness. Our wardrobes were suffering quite as much as our persons. We did not carry looking-glasses, so I am not able to speak of myself, but my colleague was a subject for a painter. Anyone seeing him must have been convinced that he was made up for the occasion, that his looped and windowed raggedness never could have resulted from any natural combination of circumstances. The fates seemed to decree that as "Junius" went naked into the Confederacy, leaving most of his wardrobe on deposit at the bottom of the Mississippi, he should come out of it in the same condition. Overcoat he had none. Pantaloons had been torn to shreds and tatters by the brambles and thorn bushes. He had a hat, which was not all a hat. It was given to him, after he had lost his own in a Rebel barn, by a warm-hearted African, as a small tribute from the intelligent contraband to his old friend the reliable gentleman, by an African who felt with the most touching propriety that it would be a shame for any correspondent of the Tribune to go bareheaded as long as a single negro in America was the owner of a hat. It was a white wool relic of the old red sandstone period, with a sugar-loaf crown, and a broad brim drawn closely over his ears, like the bonnet of an Esquimau. His boots were a stupendous refutation of the report that leather was scarce among the rebels. I understood it to be no figure of rhetoric, but the result of actual and exact measurement, which induced him to call them the 7 Leaguers. The small portion of his body, which was visible between the tops of his boots and the bottom of his hat, was robed in an old gray quilt of secession proclivities, and taken for all in all, with his pale, nervous face and his remarkable costume, he looked like a cross between the genius of intellectuality and a rebel bushwhacker. Before daylight, we shiveringly tapped on the door of a house at the foot of the Blue Ridge. "Come in," was the welcome response. Entering, we found a woman sitting by the log fire. Beginning to introduce ourselves, she interrupted. "Oh, I know all about you. You are Yankee prisoners. Your friends who passed last evening told us you were coming, and I have been sitting up all night for you. Come to the fire and dry your clothes." Stories about the War. For 2 hours we listened to her tales of the war. The history of almost every Union family was full of romance. Each unstoried mountain stream had its incidents of daring, of sagacity, and of faithfulness, and almost every green hill had been bathed in that scarlet dew from which ever springs the richest and the ripest fruit. Concealment here was difficult, so we were taken to the house of a neighbor, who also was waiting to welcome us. He took us to his storehouse, right by the roadside. "The guard," said he, "searched this building last Thursday, unsuccessfully, and are hardly likely to try it again just yet." Soon, lying near a fire upon a warm feather bed, we wooed the drowsy god with all the success which the hungry Salisbury vermin, sticking closer than brothers, would permit. Monday, January 2d. Climbing the Blue Ridge. Before night the guard returned from conducting Boothby's party, and assured us that the coast was clear. After dark, invigorated by tea and apple brandy, we followed our pilot by devious paths up the steep, fir-clad, piney slope of the Blue Ridge. The view from the summit is beautiful and impressive, but for our weariness and anxiety we should have enjoyed it very keenly. A few weeks before, the Unionist now leading us had sent his little daughter of 12 years, alone by night, 15 miles over the mountains, to warn some escaping Union prisoners that the guard had gained a clue to their whereabouts. They received the warning in season to find a place of safety before their pursuers came. We were now on the west side of the ridge. A heavy rain began to fall, and though soaked and weary, we were glad to have our tracks obliterated, and thus be insured against pursuit. The labor we delight in physics pain, but in this case the effort was so arduous that the panacea was not very effective. Thomas Starr King tells the story of a little man, who, being asked his weight, replied, "Ordinarily 120 pounds, but when I'm mad I weigh a ton." I think any one of our wet, blistered feet, which, at every step, sunk deep into the slush, would have counterbalanced his whole body. Like millstones we dragged them up hill after hill, and through the long valleys, which stretched drearily between. Though not hungering after the flesh pots of Egypt, we still thought half regretfully of our squalid Salisbury quarters, where we had at least a roof to shelter us, and a bunk of straw. But we needed no injunction to remember Lot's wife, for a pillar of salt would have represented a fabulous sum of money in the currency of the rebels, and we had no desire to swell their scanty revenues or supply their impoverished commissary department. Crossing the New River at midnight. At midnight we reached New River, 250 yards wide. Our guide took us over, one at a time, behind him upon his horse. We were probably 500 miles above the point where this river, as the great Kanawha, unites with the Ohio, but it was the first stream we had found running northward, and its soft, rippling song of home and freedom was very sweet to our ears. Already our promised land stretched before us, and the shining river seemed a pathway of light to its hither boundary. Better than Abana and Pharpar, rivers of Damascus, this was the Jordan, flowing toward all we loved and longed for. It revived the great world of work and of life which had faded almost to fable. At 2 in the morning we reached the house of a staunch Unionist, which nestled romantically in the green valley, enclosed on all sides by dark mountains. Hospitality and oratory combined. Our new friend, Herculean in frame and with a heavy tragedy voice, came out where we sat, dripping and dreary, under an old cotton gin, and addressed us in a pompous strain worthy of Sergeant Buzzfuzz. "Gentlemen," said he, "there are unfortunately at my house tonight 2 wayfarers who are rebels and traitors. If they knew of your presence, it would be my inevitable and eternal ruin. Therefore, unable to extend to you such hospitalities as I could wish, I bid you welcome to all which can be furnished by so poor a man as I. I will place you in my barn, which is warm and filled with fodder. I will bring you food and apple brandy. In the morning, when these infernal scoundrels are gone, I will entertain you under my family roof. Gentlemen, I have been a Union man from the beginning, and I shall be a Union man to the end. I had 3 sons. One died in a rebel hospital. One was killed at the Battle of the Wilderness, fighting against his will for the Southern cause. The third, thank God, is in the Union lines." Here the father overcame the orator, and, with the conjunction of apple brandy, corn bread, and quilts, we were soon asleep in the barn. End of Chapter 44. Recording by Giordano. Newport Richey, Florida. Chapter 45 of The Secret Service by Albert Richardson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Giordano. Chapter 45. No tongue, all eyes, be silent. Tempest. Over mountains and through ravines. At 9 in the morning our host awakened us. "Gentlemen, I trust you have slept well. The enemy has gone, and breakfast waits. I call you early, because I want to take you out of North Carolina into Tennessee, where I will show you a place of refuge infinitely safer than this." For the first time since leaving Salisbury, we traveled by daylight. Our guide led us deviously through fields and up almost perpendicular ascents, where the rarefied air compelled us frequently to stop for breath. We dragged our weary feet up one hill, down another, through ravines of almost impenetrable laurels, swinging across the streams by the snowy, pendant boughs, only to find another appalling height rising before us. Nothing but the hope of freedom enabled us to keep on our feet. Once, when near a public road, our guide suddenly whispered, "Hist! Drop to the ground instantly!" Lying behind logs, we saw 2 or 3 horse teams and sleds pass by, and heard the conversation of the drivers. Our pilot was not agitated, for, like all the Union mountaineers, danger had been so long a part of his everyday existence that he had no physical nervousness. But it was reported that the guards would be out today, so he was very wary and vigilant. We crossed the road in the Indian mode, walking in single file, each man treading in the footsteps of his immediate predecessor. No casual observer would have suspected that it was the track of more than one man. At 4 p.m. we entered Tennessee. which, like the passage of the New River, seemed another long stride toward home. Approaching a settlement, we went far around through the woods, persuading ourselves that we were unobserved. A mile beyond we reached a small log house, where our friend was known, and a blooming, matronly woman, with genial eyes, welcomed us. "Come in, all. I am very glad to see you. I thought you must be Yankees when I heard of your approach, about half an hour ago. How did you hear?" Mistaken for Confederate guards. A good many young men are lying out in this neighborhood, and my son is one of them. He has not slept in the house for 2 years. He always carries his rifle. At first I was opposed to it, but now I am glad to have him. They may murder him any day, and if they do, I at least want him to kill some of the traitors first. Nobody can approach this settlement, day or night, without being seen by some of these young men, always on the watch. The guard have come in twice, at midnight, as fast as they could ride, but the news traveled before them, and they found the birds flown. When you appeared in sight, the boys took you for rebels. My son and 2 others, lying behind logs, had their rifles drawn on you not more than 300 yards away. They were very near shooting you, when they discovered that you had no arms, and concluded you must be the right sort of people. In the distance you look like home guards, part of you dressed as citizens, one in rebel uniform, and 2 wearing Yankee overcoats. You are unsafe traveling a single mile through this region without sending word beforehand who you are. After dark we were shown to a barn, where we wrapped ourselves in quilts. During the last 24 hours we had journeyed 25 miles, equal to 50 upon level roads, and our eyelids were very heavy. 18. Wednesday, January 4. This settlement was intensely loyal and admirably picketed by Union women, children, and bushwhackers. We dined with the wife of a former inmate of Castle Thunder. She told us that Lafayette Jones, whose escape from that prison I have already recorded, remained in the Rebel army only a few days, deserting from it to the Union lines, and then coming back to his Tennessee home. A Rebel guerrilla killed. The Rebel guerrilla captain, who originally captured him, was notoriously cruel, had burned houses, murdered Union men, and abused helpless women. He took from Jones $200 in gold, promising to forward it to his family, but never did so. After reaching home, Jones sent a message to him that he must refund the money at once, or be killed wherever found. Jones finally sought him. As they met, the guerrilla drew a revolver and fired, but without wounding his antagonist. Thereupon Jones shot him dead on his own threshold. The Union people justified and applauded the deed. Jones was afterward captain in a loyal Tennessee regiment. His father had died in a Richmond dungeon, one of his brothers in an Alabama prison, and a second had been hung by the Rebels. The woman told us that another guerrilla, peculiarly obnoxious to the Loyalists, had disappeared early in November. A few days before we arrived, his bones were found in the woods, with 21 bullet holes through his clothing. His watch and money were still undisturbed in his pocket. Vengeance, not avarice, stimulated his destroyers. Meeting a former fellow prisoner. Here we met another of our Castle Thunder fellow prisoners, named Guy. The Richmond authorities knew he was a Union bushwhacker, and had strong evidence against him, which would have cost him his life if brought to trial. But he, too, under an assumed name, enlisted in the Rebel army, deserted, returned to Tennessee, and resumed his old pursuit as a hunter of men with new zeal and vigor. He and his companion were now armed with 16-shooter rifles, revolvers, and bowie knives. Guy's father and brother had both been killed by the guerrillas, and he was bitter and unsparing. If he ever fell into rebel hands again, his life was not worth a rushlight. But he was merry and jocular as if he had never heard of the King of Terrors. I asked him how he now regarded his Richmond adventures. He replied, "I would not take $1,000 in gold for the experience I had while in prison, but I would not endure it again for 10,000." Guy and his comrade were supposed to be "lying out," which suggested silent and stealthy movements. But on leaving us they went yelling, singing, and screaming up the valley, whooping like a whole tribe of Indians. Occasionally they fired their rifles, as if their vocal organs were not noisy enough. It was ludicrously strange deportment for hunted fugitives. "Guy always goes through the country in that way," said the woman. "He is very reckless and fearless. The rebels know it, and give him a wide field. He has killed a good many of them, first and last, and no doubt they will murder him, sooner or later, as they did his father." Alarm about rebel cavalry. At night, just as we were comfortably asleep in the barn, our host awakened us, saying, "5 rebel cavalry are reported approaching this neighborhood, with 300 more behind them, coming over the mountains from North Carolina. I think it is true, but am not certain. I am so well known as a Union man, that, if they do come, they will search my premises thoroughly. There is another barn, much more secluded, a mile farther up the valley, where you will be safer than here, and will compromise nobody if discovered. If they arrive, you shall be informed before they can reach you." Coleridge did not believe in ghosts, because he had seen too many of them. So we were skeptical concerning the rebel cavalry, having heard too much of it. But we went to the other barn, and in its ample straw loft found a North Carolina refugee, with whom we slept undisturbed. He deemed this place much safer than his home, a gratifying indication to us that the danger was growing small by degrees. 19 Thursday, January 5. This morning the good woman whose barn had sheltered us mended our tattered clothing. Her husband was a soldier in the Union service. I asked her, "How do you live and support your family?" "Very easily," she replied. "Last year I did all my own housework, and weaving, spinning, and knitting, and raised over 100 bushels of corn, with no assistance whatever except from this little girl, 11 years old. The hogs run in the woods during the summer, feeding themselves, so we are in no danger of starvation." Boothby's company, enhanced by the 2 rebel deserters from Petersburg, and a young conscript, formerly one of our prison guards at Salisbury, here rejoined us. Our entire party, numbering 10, started again at 3 p.m. The road was over Stony Mountain, very rocky and steep. As we halted wearily upon its summit, we overlooked a great waste of mountains, intersected with green valleys of pine and fir, threaded by silver streams. Our guide assured us that, at Carter's Depot, 110 miles east of Knoxville, we should find Union troops. Soon after dark, to our disappointment and indignation, he declared that he must turn back without a moment's delay. His long-deferred explanation that the young wife, whom he had left at his lonely log house, was about to endure, the pleasing punishment which women bear, mollified our wrath, and we bade him good-bye. A stanch old Unionist. After dark we found our way, deviously, around several dwellings, to the house of an old Union man. With his wife and 3 bouncing daughters, he heartily welcomed us. "I am very glad to see you. I have been looking for you these 2 hours." "Why did you expect us?" "We learned yesterday that there were 10 Yankees, one in red breeches and a rebel uniform, over the mountains. Girls, make a fire in the kitchen and get supper for these gentlemen." While we discussed the meal, and a great bucket of rosy apples before the roaring fire, our host, silver-haired, deep-chested, brawny-limbed, a splendid specimen of physical manhood, poured out his heart. He was devoted to the Union with a zeal passing the love of women. How intensely he hated the rebels! How his eyes flashed and dilated as he talked of the old flag! How perfect his faith that he should live to see it again waving triumphantly on his native mountains! One of his sons had died fighting for his country, and 2 others were still in the Union army. The most dangerous point. The old gentleman piloted us through the deep woods for 3 miles to a friendly house. We were now near a rendezvous of Rebel guerrillas, reported to be without conscience and without mercy. Their settlement was known through that whole region as Little Richmond. We must pass within a quarter of a mile of them. It was feared that they might have pickets out, and the point was deemed more dangerous than any since leaving Salisbury. Our new friend, though an invalid, promptly rose from his bed to guide us through the danger. His wife greeted us cordially, but was extremely apprehensive, darting to and from the door, and in conversation suddenly pausing to listen. When we started, she said, taking both my hands in hers, "May God prosper you and carry you safely through to those you love. But you must be very cautious. Less than 6 weeks ago my 2 brothers started for the North by the same route, and when they reached Crab Orchard, the Rebel guerrillas captured them and murdered them in cold blood." After leading us 2 miles, the guide stopped, and when all came up he whispered, "We are approaching the worst place. Let no man speak a word. Step lightly as possible, while I keep as far ahead as you can see me. If you hear any noise, dart out of sight at once. Should I be discovered with you, it would be certain death to me. If found alone, I can tell some story about sickness in my family." We crept softly behind him for 2 miles. Then, leading us through a rocky pasture into the road, he said, "Thank God! I have brought another party of the right sort of people past Little Richmond in safety. My health is broken, and I shall not live long, but it is a great consolation to know that I have been able to help some men who love the Union made by our fathers." Directing us to a staunch Unionist a few miles beyond, he returned home. At 3 in the morning we reached our destination. Davis and Boothby did pioneer duty, going forward to the house, where they were received by a clamor of dogs, which made the valleys ring. After a whispered conference with the host, they returned and said, "There is a Rebel traveler spending the night here. We are to stay in the barn until morning, when he will be gone." The all-devouring vermin. We burrowed in the warm haymow, and vainly essayed to sleep. The all-devouring vermin by this time swarmed upon us, poisoning our blood and stimulating every nerve as we tossed wearily until long after daylight. 20. Friday, January 6. At 9 o'clock this morning our host came to the hayloft and awoke us. "My troublesome guest is gone. Walk down to breakfast." He was educated, intelligent, and had been a leader among the conservative, or Union people, until compelled to acquiesce, nominally, in the war. His house and family were pleasant. But while we now began to approach civilization, the Union line steadily receded. He informed us that we would find no loyal troops east of Jonesboro, 98 miles from Knoxville, and probably none east of Greenville, 74 miles from Knoxville. "But," said he, "you are out of the woods for the present. You are on the border of the largest Union settlement in all the Rebel States. You may walk for 24 miles by daylight on the public road. Look out for strangers, home guards, or Rebel guerrillas, but you will find every man, woman, and child who lives along the route a staunch and faithful friend." With light hearts we started down the valley. It seemed strange to travel the public road by daylight, visit houses openly, and look people in the face. Our way was on the right bank of the Watauga, a broad, flashing stream, walled in by abrupt cliffs, covered with pines and hemlocks. A woman on horseback, with her little son on foot, accompanied us for several miles, saying, "If you travel alone, you are in danger of being shot for Rebel guerrillas." More Union soldiers. In the evening, a Union man rowed us across the stream. On the left bank our eyes were gladdened by 3 of our boys in blue, United States soldiers at home on furlough. Seeing us in the distance, they leveled their rifles, but soon discovered that we were not foes. Our host for the night beguiled the evening hours with stories of the war, and again we enjoyed the luxury of beds. 21. Saturday, January 7. A well-fortified refuge. A friend piloted us 8 miles over the rough, snowy mountains, avoiding public roads. In the afternoon we found shelter at a white frame house, nestling among the mountains, and fronted by a natural lawn, dotted with firs. Here, for the first time, we were entirely safe. Any possible Rebel raid must come from the south side of the river. The house was on the north bank of the stream, which was too much swollen for fording, and the only canoe within 5 miles was fastened on our shore. Thus fortified on front, flank, and rear, we took our ease in the pleasant, homelike farmhouse. Near the dwelling was a great spring of rare beauty. Within an area of 12 feet, a dozen streams, larger than one's arm, came gushing and boiling up through snow-white sand. By the aid of a great fire and an enormous iron kettle, we boiled all our clothing, and at last vanquished the troublesome enemies which, brought from the prison, had so long disturbed our peace. Then, bathing in the icy waters, we came out renewed, like the Syrian leper, and, in soft, clean beds, enjoyed the sweet sleep of childhood. 22. Sunday, January 8. A new guide took us 8 miles to a log barn in the woods. After dining among, but not upon, the husks, we started again, an old lady of 60 guiding us through the woods toward her house. Age had not withered her, nor custom staled, for she walked at a pace which made it difficult to keep in sight of her. At dark, in the deep pines, behind her lonely dwelling, we kindled a fire, supped, and with 15 or 20 companions, who had joined us so noiselessly that they seemed to spring from earth, we started on. End of chapter 45. Recording by Greg Giordano. Newport Richey, Florida. Chapter 46 of The Secret Service by Albert Richardson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Greg Giordano. Chapter 46. If I have wit enough to get out of this wood, I have enough to serve mine own turn. Midsummer Night's Dream. Dan Ellis, the Union Guide. For many months before leaving prison, we had been familiar with the name of Dan Ellis, a famous Union guide, who, since the beginning of the war, had done nothing but conduct loyal men to our lines. Ellis is a hero, and his life a romance. He had taken through, in all, more than 4,000 persons. He had probably seen more adventure, in fights and races with the rebels, in long journeys, sometimes barefooted and through the snow, or swimming rivers full of floating ice, than any other person living. He never lost but one man, who was swooped up through his own heedlessness. The party had traveled 8 or 10 days, living upon nothing but parched corn. Dan insisted that a man could walk 25 miles a day through snow upon parched corn just as well as upon any other diet, if he only thought so. I feel bound to say that I have tried it and do not think so. This person held the same opinion. He revolted against the parched corn diet, vowing that he would go to the first house and get an honest meal, if he was captured for it. He went to the first house, obtained the meal, and was captured. After we had traveled 50 miles, everybody said to us, "If you can only find Dan Ellis, and do just as he tells you, you will be certain to get through." In good hands at last. We did find Dan Ellis. On this Sunday night, 134 miles from our lines, greatly broken down, we reached a point on the road, waited for 2 hours, when along came Dan Ellis with a party of 70 men, refugees, rebel deserters, Union soldiers returning from their homes within the enemy's lines, and escaping prisoners. About 30 of them were mounted and 20 armed. Like most men of action, Dan was a man of few words. When our story had been told him, he said to his comrades, "Boys, here are some gentlemen who have escaped from Salisbury, and are almost dead from the journey. They are our people. They have suffered in our cause. They are going to their homes in our lines. We can't ride and let these men walk. Get down off your horses and help them up." Down they came, and up we went, and then we pressed along at a terrible pace. In low conversation, as we rode through the darkness, I learned from Dan and his companions something of his strange, eventful history. At the outbreak of the war, he was a mechanic in East Tennessee. After once going through the mountains to the Union lines, he displayed rare capacity for woodcraft, and such vigilance, energy, and wisdom, that he fell naturally into the pursuit of a pilot. 6 or 8 of his men, who had been with him from the beginning, were almost equally familiar with the routes. They lived near him, in Carter County, Tennessee, in open defiance of the rebels. When at home, they usually slept in the woods, and never parted from their arms for a single moment. As the rebels would show them no mercy, they could not afford to be captured. For 3 years there had been a standing offer of $5,000 for Dan Ellis's head. During that period, except when within our lines, he had never permitted his Henry rifle, which would fire 16 times without reloading, to go beyond the reach of his hand. An unequal battle. Ellis's bravery. Once, when none of his comrades, except Lieutenant Treadaway, were with him, 14 of the rebels came suddenly upon them. Ellis and Treadaway dropped behind logs and began to fire their rifles. As the enemy pressed them, they fell slowly back into a forest, continuing to shoot from behind trees. The unequal skirmish lasted 3 hours. Several rebels were wounded, and at last they retreated, leaving the 2 determined Unionists unharmed and masters of the field. Dan usually made the trip to our lines once in 3 or 4 weeks, leading through from 40 to 500 persons. Before starting, he and his comrades would make a raid upon the rebels in some neighboring county, take from them all the good horses they could find, and after reaching Knoxville, sell them to the United States quartermaster. Thus they obtained a livelihood, though nothing more. The refugees and escaping prisoners were usually penniless, and Ellis, whose sympathies flowed toward all loyal men like water, was compelled to feed them during the entire journey. He always remunerated Union citizens for provisions purchased from them. Tonight was so cold that our sore, lame joints would hardly support us upon our horses. Dan's rapid marching was the chief secret of his success. He seemed determined to keep at least one day ahead of all rebel pursuers. Now that we were safe in his hands, I accompanied the party mechanically, with no further questions or anxiety about routes, but I chanced to hear Treadaway ask him, "Don't you suppose the Nolchucky is too high for us to ford?" "Very likely," replied Dan. "We will stop and inquire of Barnett." Upon the mule which I rode, a sack of corn served for a saddle. I was not accomplished in the peculiar gymnastics required to sit easily upon it and keep it in place. Lost, a perilous blunder. Thirsty and feverish, I stopped at the crossing of Rock Creek for a draught of water and to adjust the corn sack. Attempting to remount, I was as stiff and awkward as in an octogenarian, and my restive mule would not stand for a moment. I finally succeeded in climbing upon his back 2 or 3 minutes after the last horseman disappeared up the bank. We had been traveling across forests, over hills, through swamps, without regard to thoroughfares, but I rode carelessly on, supposing that my mule's instinct would keep him on the fresh scent of the cavalcade. When we had jogged along for 10 minutes, awakening from a little reverie, I listened vainly to hear the footfalls of the horses. All was silent. I dismounted and examined the half-frozen road, but no hoof marks could be seen upon it. I was lost. It might mean recapture. It might mean re-imprisonment and death, for the terms were nearly synonymous. I was ignorant about the roads, and whether I was in a Union or Rebel settlement. To search for that noiseless, stealthy party would be useless, so I rode back to the creek, tied my mule to a laurel in the dense thicket, and sat down upon a log, pondering on my stupid heedlessness, which seemed likely to meet its just reward. I remembered that Davis owed his original capture to a mule, and wondered if the same cause was about to produce for me a like result. Mentally anathematizing my long-eared brute, I gave him a part of the corn, and threw myself down behind a log directly beside the road. This would enable me to hear the horse's feet of anyone who might return for me. In a few minutes I was sound asleep. When awakened by the cold, my watch told me that it was 3 o'clock. Running to and fro in the thicket until my blood was warmed, I resumed my position behind the log, and slept until daylight was gleaming through the forest. A most fortunate encounter. Walking back to the creek, I reconnoitered a log dwelling, so small and humble that its occupant was probably loyal. In a few minutes, through the early dawn, an old man, with a sack of corn upon his shoulder, came out of the house. He evinced no surprise at seeing me. Looking earnestly into his eyes, I asked him, "Are you a Union man or a secessionist?" He replied, "I don't know who you are, but I am a Union man, and always have been." "I am a stranger and in trouble. I charge you to tell me the truth." "I do tell you the truth, and I have 2 sons in the United States Army." His manner appeared sincere, and he carried a letter of recommendation in his open, honest face. I told him my awkward predicament. He reassured me at once. "I know Dan Ellis as well as my own brother. No truer man ever lived. What route was he going to take?" "I heard him say something about Barnett's." "That is a ford only 5 miles from here. Barnett is one of the right sort of people. This road will take you to his house. Good bye, my friend, and don't get separated from your party again." Rejoining Dan and his party. I certainly did not need the last injunction. Reaching the ford, Barnett told me that our party had spent several hours in crossing, and was encamped 3 miles ahead. He took me over the river in his canoe, my mule swimming behind. Half a mile down the road, I met Ellis and Treadaway. "Aha!" said Dan. "We were looking for you. I told the boys not to be uneasy. There are men in our crowd who would have blundered upon some Rebel, told all about us, and so alarmed the country and brought out the Home Guards. but I knew you were discreet enough to take care of yourself, and not endanger us. Let us breakfast at this Union house. 23, Monday, January 9. "Today," said Dan Ellis, "we must cross the big butte of Rich Mountain." "How far is it?" I asked. "It is generally called 10 miles, but I suspect it is about 15, and a rather hard road at that." About 15, and a rather hard road. It seemed 50, and a very via dolorosa. We started at 11 a.m. For 3 miles we followed a winding creek, the horsemen on a slow trot, crossing the stream a dozen times, the footmen keeping up as best they could, and shivering from their frequent baths in the icy waters. A terrible mountain march. We turned up the sharp side of a snowy mountain. For hours and hours we toiled along, up one rocky pine-covered hill, down a little declivity, then up another hill, then down again, but constantly gaining in height. The snow was 10 inches deep. Dan averred he had never crossed the mountain when the travel was so hard, but he pushed on, as if death were behind and heaven before. The rarity of the air at that elevation increased my pneumonic difficulty, and rendered my breath very short. Ellis furnished me with a horse the greater part of the way, but the hills, too steep for riding, compelled us to climb, our poor animals following behind. The pithy proverb that "it is easy to walk when one leads a horse by the bridle" was hardly true in my case, for it seemed 100 times today as if I could not possibly take another step, but must fall out by the roadside, and let the company go on. But after my impressive lesson of last night, I was hardly likely to halt so long as any locomotive power remained. Our men and animals, in single file, extended for more than a mile in a weary, tortuous procession, which dragged its slow length along. After hours which appeared interminable, and efforts which seemed impossible, we halted upon a high ridge, brushed the snow from the rocks, and sat down to a cold lunch, beside a clear, bright spring, which gushed vigorously from the ground. I ventured to ask, "Are we near the top?" "About halfway up," was Dan's discouraging reply. "Come, come, boys, we must pull out," urged Davis, and, following that irrepressible invalid, we moved forward again. As we climbed hill after hill, thinking we had nearly reached the summit, beyond us would still rise another mountain, a little higher than the one we stood upon. They seemed to stretch out to the crack of doom. A storm increases the discomforts. To increase the discomfort, a violent rain came on. The very memory of this day is wearisome. I pause, thankful to end only a chapter in the midst of an experience which, judged by my own feelings, appeared likely to end life itself. End of Chapter 46. Recording by Greg Giordano. Newport Richey, Florida. Chapter 47 of The Secret Service by Albert Richardson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Greg Giordano. Chapter 47. It hath been the longest night that e'er I watched, and the most heaviest. Two Gentlemen of Verona. But for this miracle, I mean our preservation, few in millions can speak like us. Tempest. As I toiled, staggering, up each successive hill, it seemed that this terrible climbing and this torturing day would never end. But necessity and hope work miracles, and strength proved equal to the hour. At 4 p.m. the clouds broke, the sun burst out, as we stood on the icy summit, revealing a grand view of mountains, valleys, and streams on every side. After a brief halt, we began the descent. Our path, trodden only by refugees and prisoners, led by Dan Ellis, had been worn so deep by the water that, in many places, our bodies were half concealed. How Dan rushed down those steep declivities! It was easy to follow now, and I kept close behind him. Fording creeks in the darkness. Twilight, dusk, darkness came on, and again the rain began to pour down. We could not see each other 5 yards away. We pressed steadily on. We reached the foot of the mountain, and were in a dark, pine-shadowed, winding road, which frequently crossed a swollen, foamy creek. At first Dan hunted for logs, but the darkness made this slow work. He finally abandoned it, and, whenever we came to a stream, plunged in up to the middle, dashed through, and rushed on, with dripping garments. Our cavalcade and procession must have stretched back fully 3 miles, but every man endeavored to keep within shouting distance of his immediate predecessor. Prospect of a dreary night. "We shall camp tonight," said Dan, "at a lonely house 2 miles from the foot of the mountain." Reaching the place, we found that, since his last journey, this dwelling had tumbled down, and nothing was left but a labyrinth of timbers and boards. We laboriously propped up a section of the roof. It proved a little protection from the dripping rain, and, while the rest of the party slowly straggled in, Treadaway went to the nearest Union house to learn the condition of the country. In 15 minutes we heard the tramp of his returning horse, and could see a firebrand glimmering through the darkness. "Something wrong here," said Dan. "There must be danger, or he would not bring fire, expecting us to stay out of doors such a night as this. What is the news, Treadaway?" "Bad enough," replied the lieutenant, dismounting from his dripping horse, carefully nursing, between 2 pieces of board, the glowing firebrand. "The Rebel guerrillas are thick and vigilant. A party of them passed here only this evening. I tell you, Dan Ellis, we've got to keep a sharp eye out, if we don't want to be picked up." All who could find room huddled under the poorly propped roof, which threatened to fall and crush them. Dan and his immediate comrades, with great readiness, improvised a little camp for themselves, so thatching it with boards and shingles that it kept the water off their heads. They were soon asleep, grasping their inseparable rifles, and near their horses, from which they never permitted themselves to be far away. With my 2 journalistic friends, I deemed rest nearly as important as safety, for we needed to accumulate strength. We found our way through the darkness to the nearest Union house. There was a great fire blazing on the hearth, but the little room was crowded with our weary and soaking companions who had anticipated us. Sleeping among the husks. We crossed the creek to another dwelling, where the occupant, a lifelong invalid, was intensely loyal. With his wife and little son, he greeted us very warmly, adding, "I wish I could keep you in my house, but it would not be safe. We will give you quilts, and you may sleep among the husks in the barn, where you will be warm and dry. If the guards come during the night, they will be likely to search the house first, and the boy or the woman can probably give you warning. But, if they do find you, of course you will tell them that we are not privy to your concealment, because, you know, it would be a matter of life and death for me." We found the husks dry and fragrant, and soon forgot our weariness. 24. Tuesday, January 10. Breakfasting before daylight, that we might not be seen leaving the house, we sought our rendezvous. Those who had remained in camp were a wet, cold, sorry-looking party. By 9 o'clock, several, who had been among the Union people in the neighborhood, returned and held a consultation. The accounts of all agreed that, 15 or 20 miles ahead, the danger was great, and the country exceedingly difficult to pass through. Moreover, the Union forces still appeared to recede as we approached the places where they were reputed to be. We were now certain that there were none at Jonesboro, none at Greenville, probably none east of Strawberry Plains. Turning back in discouragement. 8 or 10 of our party determined to turn back. Among them were 3 Union soldiers who had seen service and peril. But they said to us, as they turned to retrace their steps over Rich Mountain, "It is useless to go on. The party will never get through in the world. Not a single man of it will reach Knoxville, unless he waits till the road is clear." Ellis and Treadaway listened to them with a quiet smile. The perils ahead did not disturb our serenity, because they were so much lighter than the perils behind. We had left horrors to which all future possibilities were a mercy. We had looked in at the windows of death, and stood upon the verge of the life to be. We doubted not that the difficulties were greatly magnified, and all dangers looked infinitesimal along the path leading toward home and freedom. Among those who went back was a North Carolina citizen, accompanied by a little son, the child of his old age. Reluctant to trust himself again to the tender mercies of the Rebels, he was unaccustomed to the war-path, and decided to return to the ills he had had, rather than fly to others which he knew not of. Purchasing one of his horses, I was no longer dependent upon the kindness of Ellis and his comrades for a steed. Before noon we started, following secluded valley paths. The rain ceased, and the day was pleasant. At a Union dwelling we came upon the hot track of 8 guerrillas, who had been there only an hour before. The Rebel hunting instinct waxed strong within Dan, and, taking 8 of his own men, he started in fierce pursuit, leaving Treadaway in charge of the company. Before dark, we reached Kelly's Gap, camping in an old orchard beside a large farmhouse with many ample outbuildings. The place was now deserted. One of our guides explained. "A Union man lived here, and he was hanged last year upon that apple tree. They cut him down, however, before he died, and he fled from the country." Tying our horses to the trees, we parched corn for supper. Fires were kindled in the buildings, giving the place a genial appearance as night closed in. A Rebel prisoner brought in. After dark, Dan and his comrades returned. The whole party of guerrillas had very narrowly escaped them. They captured one and brought him in a prisoner. One of the outbuildings was cleaned, and he was placed in it, under 2 volunteer guards armed with rifles. He was not more than 22 years old, and had a heavy, stolid face. He steadily denied that he was a guerrilla, asserting that he had been in the Rebel army, had deserted from it, taken the oath of allegiance to the United States while at Knoxville, and was now trying to live quietly. Some of Ellis's men believed that he had broken his oath of allegiance, and was the most obnoxious of the guerrillas. In his presence they discussed freely the manner of disposing of him. Some advocated taking him to Knoxville and turning him over to the authorities. Others, who seemed to be a majority, urged taking him out into the orchard and shooting him. This counsel seemed likely to prevail. Several of the men who gave it had seen brothers or fathers murdered by the Rebels. The prisoner had little intelligence, and talked only when addressed. I could but admire the external stolidity with which he listened to these discussions. One of his judges and would-be executioners asked him, "Well, sir, what have you to say for yourself?" "I am in your hands," he replied, without moving a muscle. "You can kill me if you want to, but I have kept the oath of allegiance, and I am innocent of the charges you bring against me." After some further debate, a Union officer from East Tennessee said, He may deserve death, and he probably does, but we are not murderers, and he shall not be shot. I will use my own revolver on anybody who attempts it. Let us hear no more of these taunts. No brave man will insult a prisoner." It was at last decided to take him to Knoxville. He bore this decision with the same silence he had manifested at the prospect of death. During this scene Dan was absent. He had gone to the nearest Union house to learn the news, for every loyal family in a range of many hundred miles knew and loved him. We, very weary, lay down to sleep in an old orchard, with our saddles for pillows. Our reflections were pleasant. We were only 79 miles from the Union lines. We progressed swimmingly, and had even begun to regulate the domestic affairs of the border. An alarm at midnight. Before midnight, someone shook my arm. I rubbed my eyes open and looked up. There was Dan Ellis. "Boys, we must saddle instantly. We have walked right into a nest of rebels. Several hundred are within a few miles. 80 are in this immediate vicinity. They are lying in ambush for Colonel Kirk and his men. It is doubtful whether we can ever get out of this. We must divide into 2 parties. The footmen must take to the mountains. We who are riding, and in much greater danger, as horses make more noise, and leave so many traces, must press on at once, if we ever hope to." The word was passed in low tones. Our late prisoner, no longer an object of interest, was allowed to wander away at his own sweet will. Flinging our saddles upon our weary horses, we were in motion almost instantly. My place was near the middle of the cavalcade. The man just before me was riding a white horse, which enabled me to follow him with ease. We galloped along at Dan's usual pace, with sublime indifference to roads, up and down rocky hills, across streams, through swamps, over fences, everywhere but upon public thoroughfares. A young lady for a guide. I supposed we had traveled 3 miles, when Davis fell back from the front and said to me, "That young lady rides very well, does she not?" "What young lady?" "The young lady who was piloting us." I had thought Dan Ellis was piloting us, and rode forward to see about the young lady. There she was. I could not scrutinize her face in the darkness, but it was said to be comely. I could see that her form was graceful, and the ease and firmness with which she sat on her horse would have been a lesson for a riding master. The Nameless Heroine. She was a member of the loyal family to which Dan had gone for news. The moment she learned his need, she volunteered to pilot him out of that neighborhood, where she was born and bred, and knew every acre. The only accessible horse, one belonging to a Rebel officer, but just then kept in her father's barn, was brought out and saddled. She mounted, came to our camp at midnight, and was now stealthily guiding us, avoiding farmhouses where the Rebels were quartered, going round their camps, evading their pickets. She led us for 7 miles. Then, while we remained in the wood, she rode forward over the long bridge which spanned the Nolchucky River, now to be crossed a second time, to see if there were any guards upon it, went to the first Union house beyond, to learn whether the roads were picketed, came back, and told us the coast was clear. Then she rode by our long line toward her home. Had it been safe to cheer, we should certainly have given 3 times 3 for the nameless heroine, who did us such vital kindness. Benisons upon her dear head forever. End of chapter 47. Recording by Greg Giordano. Newport Richey, Florida. Chapter 48 of The Secret Service by Albert Richardson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Greg Giordano. Chapter 48. Fortune is merry, and in this mood will give us anything. Julius Caesar. The night is long that never finds the day. Macbeth. Among the Delectable Mountains. Relieved again from immediate danger, everything seemed like a blessed dream. I was haunted by the fear of waking to find myself in the old bunk at Salisbury, with its bare and squalid surroundings. We were often compelled to walk and lead our weary animals. The rushing creeks were perilous to cross by night. The rugged mountains were appalling to our aching limbs and frost-bitten feet. The Union houses, where we obtained food and counsel, were often humble and rude. But we had vanquished the giant despair, and come up from the valley of the shadow of death. To our eyes, each icy stream was the river of life. The frowning cliffs, with their cruel rocks, were the very Delectable Mountains, and every friendly log cabin was the palace called Beautiful. After our fair guide left us, Dan's foot was on his native heath. Familiar with the road, he pressed on like a fate, without mercy to man or beast. After the late heavy rains, it was now growing intensely cold. A crust, not yet hard enough to bear, was forming upon the mud, and at every step our poor horses sunk to the fetlocks. Even with frequent walking, I found it difficult to keep up the circulation in my own sensitive feet. But the severe admonition of one frostbite had taught me to be very cautious. A young North Carolinian, riding a mule, wore nothing upon his feet except a pair of cotton stockings. That he kept from freezing is one of the unsolved mysteries of human endurance. Passing a few miles north of Greenville, at 4 o'clock in the morning, we had accomplished 25 miles, despite all our weakness and weariness. This brought us to Lick Creek, which proved too much swollen for fording. An old loyalist, living on the bank, assured us that guerrillas were numerous and vigilant. Should we never leave them behind? Ascending the stream for 3 miles, we crossed upon the only bridge in that whole region. Here, at least, our rear was protected, because, if pursued, we could tear up the planks. Soon after dawn, upon a hillside in the pine woods, we dismounted and huddled around our fires, a weary, hungry, morose, and melancholy company. Separation from Junius. 25. Wednesday, January 11. As we drowsed upon the pine leaves, I asked, "When shall we join the footmen?" "After we reach Knoxville," was Dan Ellis's reply. This was a source of uneasiness to Davis and myself, because we had left Junius behind. He was offered a horse when we started, at midnight. Supposing, like ourselves, that the parties would reunite in a few hours, and tired of riding without a saddle, he declined, and cast his lot among the footmen. It was the first separation since our capture. Our fates had been so long cast together that we meant to keep them united until deliverance should come for one or both, either through life or death. But Treadaway was an excellent pilot, and the footmen, able to take paths through the mountains where no cavalry could follow them, would probably have less difficulty than we. Union women scrutinizing the Yankee. I found an old man splitting rails down in a wooded ravine 200 or 300 yards from our camp. While he went to his house, a mile distant, to bring me food, I threw myself on the ground beside his fire and slept like a baby. In an hour he returned with a basket containing a great plate of the inevitable bread and pork. He was accompanied by his wife and daughter, who wanted to look at the Yankee. Coarse-featured and hard-handed, they were smoking long pipes, but they were not devoid of womanly tenderness, and earnestly asked if they could do anything to help us. About noon we broke camp, and compelled our half-dead horses to move on. The road was clearer and safer than we anticipated. At the first farm which afforded corn, we stopped 2 or 3 hours to feed and rest the poor brutes. 3 of us rode forward to a Union house, and asked for dinner. The woman, whose husband belonged to the 16th Loyal Tennessee Infantry, prepared it at once, but it was an hour before we finally convinced her that we were not rebels in disguise. We passed through Russellville soon after dark, and, 2 miles beyond, made a camp in the deep woods. The night was very cold, and despite the expostulations of Dan Ellis, who feared they belonged to a Union man, we gathered and fired huge piles of rails, one on either side of us. Making a bed between them of the soft, fragrant twigs of the pine, we supped upon burnt corn in the ear. By replenishing our great fires once an hour, we spent the night comfortably. 26. Thursday, January 12. At our farmhouse, breakfast this morning, a sister of Lieutenant Treadaway was our hostess. She gave us an inviting meal, in which coffee, sugar, and butter, which had long been only reminiscences to us, were the leading constituents. By 10 we were again upon the road. 2 or 3 of our armed men kept the advance as scouts, but we now journeyed with comparative impunity. Slide down off that horse. Some of our young men, who had long been hunted by the rebels, embraced every possible opportunity of turning the tables. No haste, weariness, or danger could induce them to omit following the track of guerrillas, wherever there was a reasonable hope of finding the game. On the road today, one of these footmen met a citizen riding a fine horse. "What are you, Southerner or Union?" asked the boy, playing with the hammer of his rifle. "Well," replied the old Tennessean, a good deal alarmed, "I have kept out of the war from the beginning. I have not helped either side." "Come, come, that will never do. You don't take me for a fool, do you? You never could have lived in this country without being either one thing or the other. Are you Union or secession?" "I voted for secession." "Tell the entire truth." "Well, sir, I do. I have 2 sons in Johnson's army. I was an original secessionist, and I am as good a Southern man as you can find in the state of Tennessee." "All right, my old friend, just slide down off that horse." "What do you mean?" "I mean that you are just the man I have been looking for, and walking about 100 miles, a good Southerner with a good horse. I am a Yankee. We are all Yankees, so slide down and be quick about it." Accompanied by the clicking of the rifle, the injunction was not to be despised. The rider came down, the boy mounted and galloped up the road, while the old citizen walked slowly homeward, with many a longing, lingering look behind. We traveled 25 miles today, and at night made our camp in the pine woods near Friend's Station. Friendly words, but hostile eyes. As the country was now comparatively safe, Davis and myself went in pursuit of beds. At the first house, 2 women assured us that they were good Union people, and very sorry they had not a single vacant couch. Their words were unexceptionable, but I could not see the welcome in their eyes. We afterward inquired, and found that they were violent rebels. The next dwelling was a roomy old farmhouse, with pleasant and generous surroundings. In answer to our rap, a white-haired patriarch of 70 came to the door. "Can you give us supper and lodging tonight, and breakfast in the morning? We will pay you liberally, and be greatly obliged beside." "I should be glad to entertain you," he replied, in tremulous, childish treble, "but to-night my daughters are all gone to a frolic. I have no one in the house except my wife, who, like myself, is old and feeble." Hospitalities of a loyal patriarch. The lady, impelled by curiosity, now appearing, we repeated the request to her, with all the suavity and persuasiveness at our command, for we were hungry and tired, and the place looked inviting. She dryly gave us the same answer, but began to talk a little. Presently we again inquired, "Will you be good enough to accommodate us, or must we look farther?" What are you, anyhow?" "Union men, Yankees, escaped from the Salisbury prison." "Why didn't you say so before? Of course I can give you supper. Come in, all of you." The old lady prepared us the most palatable meal we had yet found, and told us the usual stories of the war. For hours, by the log fire, we talked with the aged couple, who had 3 sons carrying muskets in the Union army, and who loved the cause with earnest, enthusiastic devotion. We were no longer apprehensive, for they assured us that the Rebels had never yet searched their premises. In this respect they had been singularly fortunate. Theirs was the only one among the hundreds of Union houses we entered which had not been despoiled by Rebel marauders. More than once the Confederates had taken from them grain and hay to the value of hundreds of dollars, but their dwelling had always been respected. 27. Friday, January 13. My poor steed gave signs of approaching dissolution, and I asked the first man I saw by the roadside, "Would you like a horse?" "Certainly, stranger." "Very well, take this one." I handed him the bridle, and he led the animal away with a look of wonder. But it could not have taken him long to comprehend the nature of my generosity. Several other horses in the party had died, or were left behind as worthless. Our journey, originally estimated at 200 miles, had now grown into 295 by the roads. In view of our devious windings, we deemed 340 miles a very moderate estimate of the distance we had traveled. Out of the mouth of hell. At 10 o'clock on the morning of this 27th day came our great deliverance. It was at Strawberry Plains, 15 miles east of Knoxville. Here, after a final march of 7 miles, in which our heavy feet and aching limbs grew wonderfully light and agile, in silence, with bowed heads, with full hearts, and with wet eyes, we saluted the old flag. End of Chapter 48. Recording by Greg Giordano, Newport Richey, Florida.
Section 49 of The Secret Service by Albert Richardson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Maria Kasper and Greg Giordano. Epilogue. A song for the nameless heroine who aided the escaping prisoners. Words and music composed by B.R. Hanby.
Out of the jaws of death, out of the mouth of hell, weary and hungry and fainting and sore, fiends on the track of them, fiends at the back of them, fiends all around but an angel before, fiends all around but an angel before, blessings be thine, loyal maid, evermore, fiends all around but an angel before, blessings be thine, loyal maid, evermore. Out by the mountain path, down through the darksome glen, heedless of foes, nor at danger dismayed, sharing their doubtful fate, daring the tyrant's hate, heart of a lion, the form of a maid. Hail to the angel who goes on before, blessings be thine, loyal maid, evermore. Hail to the angel who goes on before, blessings be thine, loyal maid, evermore. Nameless for foes may hear, but by our love for thee, soon our bright sabers shall blush with their gore. Then shall our banner free wave, maiden, over thee. Then, noble girl, thou'lt be nameless no more. Then we shall hail thee from mountain to shore. Bless thy brave heart, loyal maid, evermore. Then we shall hail thee from mountain to shore. Bless thy brave heart, loyal maid, evermore. End of chapter 49. End of The Secret Service by Albert Richardson.